Hi, welcome again to the best year of your life. I'm here with Oren Sofer, mindfulness teacher, communications trainer, and author of Say What You Mean, a mindful approach to nonviolent communication. Welcome, Oren. It's really, really lovely to be here with you today.
Thanks, Sarah. Happy to be here.
So, today in our summit, the theme is relationships.
Mm.
So, that's a topic that obviously covers a lot of ground. One thing that's certainly important for relationships is good communication. I don't know if you could just riff on that for a minute for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, as human beings, we're social creatures, obviously, and relationships play a huge role in the quality of our life, right? If you think about for a moment the times in your life where you were happiest or the times when you were struggling the most and look around, I would be willing to bet that the quality of your relationships played a significant role in how you were doing, whether you were really thriving or really struggling, right? And so when we think about that and realize how important relationships are to our own sense of well being and the quality of our life, we can then go a step further and realize, well, what determines the quality of our relationships? And communication plays a large role in that because communication is really, it's not the only, but it's the primary medium through which we relate and connect with other people. So being able to develop our communication skills, have more meaningful conversations, communicate in ways that are more aligned with our values, all of that goes to enhance our relationships, which then is obviously going to improve the quality of our life, our communities, and our society.
Thank you for that. It strikes me that you've spent an awful lot of your life deepening your understanding about what goes into healthy communication and teaching and writing and training about that. And I'm
Hmm.
wondering, based on your experience, what are a couple of critical things about communication that people often don't get right?
Mm. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Um, I think a lot of times there's a few things. One, a lot of the times in communication, we tend to focus on ourselves, of what I want to say and the point I want to get across to you. Um, and that really can be quite limiting because communication is obviously a relational thing. It's about sending and receiving messages. And so if we shift our focus from what I want to say or getting my message across to, am I building connection and understanding with this person? That can go a long way. Just that shift in the framework or the focus from getting what I want, getting my point across to, are we hearing each other?
Mm, mm,
And essentially, I define communication as a flow of understanding.
mm.
Right? If we're not hearing each other, by definition, we're not communicating. So to take as the foundation and as a core intention to build understanding is one thing that I think can transform our conversations right from the get-go. Another really central thing that we tend to overlook, but I think is quite apparent if we step back, is that meaningful conversations and healthy relationships require presence,
Yeah.
right? If we're not really here, what kind of conversation are we having? So, again, we tend to focus on the words or what we're saying or the message, and that can overshadow the importance of really just being able to show up fully in ourselves. And that goes a long way to communicating something really profound and important to the other person, which is, this is important to me. This conversation, what we're talking about is meaningful enough that I'm willing to give you one of my most precious resources, my time, my
Mm,
attention, my energy. And then I'd say the last thing, maybe that we can overlook easily in communication, is just the simple fact that it's a learnable skill. Lots of
mm,
times people might have this idea like, oh, I'm a really good listener, but I have a lot of trouble speaking up, or vice versa. Like, I can really speak my mind, but I'm not such a good listener. And we forget the fact that we all learned to communicate. This is a skill that we developed over time through training, through habits, through observation, through repetition. And that means that we can relearn it, we can retrain ourselves. And that's really the focus of a lot of my work, is how do we do that in a reliable and systematic way so that we start to see benefits and changes in our lives and our relationships.
yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. I think that quality of presence is just so foundational to communication. Absolutely. And it's also, it seems to me, it's very related to this whole other nugget that you write and teach so much about, which is the nonviolent communication.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more, what is that, and why is that such an effective way to communicate?
Sure, absolutely. So the heart of the communication training that I've received and that I share and offer to others comes from the work of Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, who founded this system of communication called nonviolent communication. Um, a lot could be said about it. I think a few key things are first and foremost that it's really a practice of transforming our awareness and our consciousness. So much of communication is not in the words, it's in where we're coming from. And as we've already been talking about, the quality of understanding and connection that we're able to create with one another. And that's something that's intangible. That's something that's influenced by so many different factors. One of the primary ones being, how are we showing up in our heart? What's our intention, and how are we relating to the other person, to ourselves, to the situation? And then the words come after that. So the training in nonviolent communication, or NVC as it's known as it's referred to in its kind of shortened version, is really about shifting how we relate to and understand ourselves, other people, and life.
Mm,
Um, it's called nonviolent communication for two important reasons. Number one, Dr. Rosenberg saw communication as an essential aspect of social change.
mm,
And so he was deeply committed to transforming the systems and institutions of our society, to creating a more just and equitable world where everyone has the tools for making peace and everyone's needs are valued. And so he called it nonviolent communication, one, to place it within the tradition of Kingian and Gandhian nonviolence, because he saw it as an essential piece of social movements and movements for transformation. But number two, he also recognized through his own research and study, his work with mentors like Carl Rogers, that the ways in which we think and speak play a large role in determining whether or not we will see violence as
mm,
a viable strategy
right.
or attending to our needs when they're not met on any level.
Mm,
And so transforming our communication and our thinking is a way of learning to embody the spirit and the essence of nonviolence in a deeper way, which is not about being passive.
right.
It's actually about engaging in a very proactive, clear, and courageous way
Mm.
in the situations in our lives that go against our values. So the last thing I want to share here, Sarah, is you said, why is nonviolent communication such an effective tool, an effective way to communicate? And I wouldn't make that assumption,
Ah,
even though I'm someone who's devoted 20 years of my life to studying and learning and sharing nonviolent communication with others, because NVC is a tool.
mm, mm,
And just like any other tool, it depends on how you use it.
yep.
If you know how to use the tool properly,
Mhm,
you can do amazing things with it.
sure.
But if you misuse it, if you don't hold it right, if you don't know how to use it correctly, you can actually do a lot of harm with it, like any
Mm,
other tool. So there isn't anything I would say, inherent to the tool that is, um, you know, inevitably going to make it useful. It's how we relate and hold it. So at the heart of nonviolent communication is one very particular, powerful and transformative perspective
mm,
that comes out of humanistic psychology and the work of people like Rogers and Maslow, which is the perspective or the understanding that part of what makes us human is that we share certain underlying fundamental universal needs.
mm, mm,
And that if we can begin to view and understand our situations and conflicts and experiences from this perspective of more fundamental universal needs, what really matters to us? What's important? What are we longing for? There's a lot more room to understand each other, to access compassion,
right.
to touch into our shared humanity, and eventually to work towards more creative solutions.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really great to articulate that it's not necessarily the tool itself, it's how you use it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
for
And,
sure.
and one of the things for anyone who's come across nonviolent communication, you may have had the experience of somebody using NVC on you and feeling really turned off by it. I was just talking to a friend the other day who had a friend who'd done some NVC training, and early in her learning of these tools, as
Mhm.
quite common experience, she was trying to use them with I don't know if it was, I think it was her younger brother who was like 9 years old. And so we teach a certain form of listening, a kind of active listening in NVC, where you're guessing the person's feelings and needs. And she was doing it in a way that was formulaic, that wasn't really connected to where we started from, which is the whole point of communication, is to connect, is to build understanding.
Yeah.
And as she was doing it, her younger brother just kind of looked at her and said, "What are you doing to me?" you know, "Stop doing that." And she was flexible and attuned enough to recognize, like, oh, this isn't working, and just put the framework down and just see and connect with her brother in front of
Mhm.
her, which I would say is actually more in line with the principles of nonviolent
Yeah.
communication than using the form. And so this is a
Right.
really important distinction in any communication technique, and in fact in any kind of contemplative practice or craft, which is that difference between the form that we learn and the underlying principles or the spirit behind it. And so the spirit behind NVC is, how do I establish enough understanding and connection so that we can work together?
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, thank you. Since we're sort of in that space of, you communicating about communication, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, some of the touch points from your book, Say What You Mean.
Hmm.
You talk a lot about speaking so others will hear you.
Mhm.
Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Sure. Speaking so others will hear you. So, one of the things to do in our conversations is to step back and consider, why am I speaking?
Mm.
What's my purpose here? Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, if a human being has opened their mouth and is speaking, we want to be heard.
Mhm.
There are situations where our purpose in speaking is less actually about sending a message that we want to be heard, and more about um, being in integrity,
Mm.
speaking up against some injustice, saying, like, that's not okay with me, what just happened. And it's less important to me that maybe the person I'm speaking to understand me, and more important that those around me um, have the experience of feeling support and solidarity, that someone else sees what's happening and is speaking out against it. So there are situations where being heard isn't the primary motivation. But by and large, in most situations, if we're speaking, we want someone to listen. We want someone to be heard. So when we recognize that, if the purpose of my speaking is that I want to feel heard, understood, I want my message to come across, then it's worthwhile to take into account the other person's capacity and to
Mhm.
consider, okay, if I really want this person to hear me, if I want to feel understood and seen, how can I say this in a way that's going to make it easier for that person to hear me?
Mm.
So there's a fine line here, right? There's a balance. There's a balance between being fully authentic, right? Like, I don't want to go around in my life trying to fit myself into a box, saying, well, this person needs me to be this way and that person needs me to be that way. That's not going to work. So on the one hand, I want to know what's important to me in terms of how I show up and
Mhm.
what my values are. And at the same time, I want to be clear about who I'm speaking to and what's the most effective way to say what I'm saying such that this person can hear it. And a lot of the times, as we start to examine the ways that we've learned to communicate, particularly when we're telling someone about something that doesn't work for us, I want something different. Say you have a coworker who, you know, doesn't do things in the way that you would like. Now, our tendency is to express ourselves in some way that lays blame on the other person. You're not doing this right. It should be done this way. Why are you that way? You need to do it this way. And our energy is focused outward on what that person is doing wrong. So if we step back and we think about, okay, what's my goal here? Well, I want this person to understand what's not working for me, and I want them to change their behavior. I want them to do something different. How useful of a strategy is it to go about telling that person everything they're doing wrong and blaming them?
Doesn't work very well.
Right. When people blame us, we tend to get defensive. So if we step back and we realize, well, gee, my purpose is to be understood and to affect some change in behavior, it's going to be much more effective to speak about what's important to me, what I see. So we can get into, you asked earlier, what is nonviolent communications? We can get into some of the form of nonviolent communication here, bearing in mind that this is a way of shifting our perspective, of
Mm,
getting clearer about what matters to me and what I want to communicate. It's not a script.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
So the form of NVC teaches us, it trains us to consider what actually happened, right? So, well, we had this agreement that, this step of the project would be done by Wednesday, and now it's Thursday and it's not done. That's what happened. How do I feel about it, right? Rather than I feel let down, I feel manipulated. Those are all stories and judgments about the other person. How do I actually feel? I'm frustrated. I'm confused, right? I might be annoyed. So just checking in, okay, what's going on for me? And then recognizing that our emotions are information.
Right.
Our
Mm,
emotions point to things that matter. If you didn't care about something, you wouldn't be feeling any emotions about it. So take those emotions and then listen at a deeper level for, okay, what really matters to me here? Is it about teamwork? Is it about reliability? Is it about, meeting deadlines and doing the best job possible? And then the last piece is, what do I want to ask for?
mm,
What do I think can move this situation forward even one step? So these are the four main components of training our attention in nonviolent communication: an observation, what happened, how do I feel about it, why, what needs are present, and then a request, some suggestion or offer about what I think might be helpful.
yeah, that's great. That's great. It seems like it's really, really important to really focus in on, what really matters in that interaction.
Right.
And that if we don't do that, then we're going to miss all the cues.
hmm Right. And then taking that sense of what matters and recognizing that there's a relationship here. There's another person with their own experience, their own needs, their own circumstances, and then to be able to, through empathy,
Mm,
through presence and recognition, say, well, I wonder what's going on for this person, right?
right.
What factors might have contributed to them not being able to meet that deadline? Did we have a misunderstanding? Did something else come up that was more important? Did they have some personal crisis that, got in the way? So one of the things that I teach in terms of the intention behind these tools is, as much as possible, trying to approach situations from curiosity and care,
Mm,
coming
mm,
to coming to it with an open mind rather than prejudging the situation, saying like, hey, I noticed we had agreed that you'd have that thing on Wednesday yesterday, and I don't see it in my inbox. Is everything okay? What's going on?
mm.
Leading with that kind of openness to invite the other person to share information that we might not be aware of. And that's recognizing, this person has their needs too, and maybe there's something that I don't know about here.
Right. Right. I think so much of the time we get in our own way, with the communication because we're locked into our own feelings. We may not have the practice around having awareness.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that shift that can happen. We kind of go from this locked in place where we don't know, we don't know what we're feeling. We definitely don't know what the other person is feeling. But where's that shift come from? Where can we actually lean into understanding what that other person may actually be concerned about?
Mm. Yeah, it's a great question, Sarah. So, I think it starts so much of these tools and so much of healthy relationships and better conversations begins with our relationship with ourselves.
Mm,
And it's kind of counterintuitive in a way because we think about my relationships, we tend to look outwards, right? But if I'm not really connected to myself, present, available, if I don't know what's important to me and what's happening, then who is the other person being in relationship with? Right? Like if I'm not here, there's no one to be in relationship with. So the foundation is really starting to take the time and get curious to investigate what's true for me, what's actually happening, and to shift from living in the world of our thoughts, our interpretations, our blame, what happened in the past, and seeing the other person through the lens of the past. So this really comes into play in intimate relationships where we're carrying a history, sometimes of decades,
Mhm.
of patterns and habits and experiences, and saying, okay, that all happened and it's influencing the present, but what's happening right now?
Yeah.
How do I actually feel? And then really, as we were just talking about, what matters to me?
Right.
What's actually important? And this is one of the most powerful and transformative questions we can ask ourselves. What really matters to me? A lot of the times we don't know. We might know what we want, or more common, we know what we don't want. I want you to stop doing that,
Right.
right? So, what do I want? And then why? Why is that important to me? See, and I'm going to get to your question about how do we do that for the other person. But if we don't know that about ourselves, then it's very dubious in a certain way to start to try to do that for the other person. And some of us, depending on our social location or our gender identity, have been conditioned to do that, to focus only on the other person to the
Yes.
detriment of knowing what's important to us. So, depending on where you're starting from, in terms of your patterning and your conditioning and the role that society has placed on you, it may be more important to, say, emphasize identifying and connecting with what's important to you, your own needs, and reclaiming those and working with the fear, the shame, the vulnerability that comes with acknowledging one's own needs. Or, if you've been socialized to be really focused on oneself and one's own needs because you're in a more dominant position in the society through class, gender, race,
Mhm.
then it might be important to actually start to look outside of yourself and consider what's this person's experience and how are they seeing things and what do they need. So we start by asking that question: what's really important to me? What matters? Because most of our conflicts and our disagreements happen at the level of what we call our strategies. Now, our
Mm.
strategies are what we want, right? I want you to have that report in on time. I want you to take more time off of work and have time for the family. I'd like this policy changed in our community. These are what we want.
Yeah.
And that's the realm in which what I want and what you want might differ, and we end up butting heads and being in a tug of war. And the person with more power or more leverage or a bigger stick wins. What nonviolent communication and many other forms of communication techniques invite us to do is to say, can we shift our attention from what we want to why we want it? Why
Mm.
is that particular thing important to you? What is it going to do for you? And that's about getting to our more fundamental needs. When we start to recognize that, what's it about?
Mm.
Right? Is it about having more of a voice? Is it about knowing that the other person cares? Is it about having access to resources in a way that's equitable in our community? Is it about feeling safe in
Mm.
our streets? As we start to be able to identify what actually matters to us,
Yeah.
that's where we can start to have more of a dialogue, because the deeper we go to the fundamental needs, the less conflict there is. There's more room for agreement and shared humanity when we talk about, you know, everyone experiencing dignity,
Yeah.
people having access to basic resources,
Mhm.
knowing that I matter, valuing our family, things like that. It's like, yeah, of course I want that. Then we start to realize, oh, we're on the same team. We want the same thing fundamentally.
Mhm.
We just have a disagreement about how to get there. And now we can start to have a conversation that's less of a conflict. We're not butting heads. Now we're partners looking at a situation together and trying to figure out and brainstorm, how do we attend to all of the different variables and needs that are present. So all that begins with being clear about what matters to me,
Mhm.
and then recognizing we live in an interdependent world.
Mm.
If I go about my life just trying to get my needs met at the expense of others, I'm going to pay a price for that. I'm going to pay a price in the quality of my relationships, the level of trust I have with people, not to mention the level of generosity and willingness others have to really show up for my time and need. So it's in our best interest. The Dalai Lama talks about enlightened self interest,
Yeah.
recognizing that being there for others, attending to their needs, ultimately helps to serve us, to say that, you know, yes, this is important to me, and what's important to you? Because if I can account for that, now there's more energy, there's more resource, there's more creativity to meet my needs in a way that that doesn't come at the expense of others.
Right.
So how do we do that for others? This is where empathy comes in, which
Mm.
is that capacity to tune into another's experience and use our own intelligence emotionally, our own life experiences to imagine what's it like for you and what might matter for you.
Mm.
And
That's
the thing
yeah.
that's so powerful, I know I've kind of been
No,
on
it's
a
great.
roll here. I'll just say one more thing, that the thing that's so powerful and transformative about empathy and about putting your attention on someone else and considering what really matters for you, what's important to you, is that we don't have to get it right.
Right. Mm.
We don't have to know, but there's something in the activity and the shift of inquiring that starts to change the dynamic. It opens our heart. And if the other person has any modicum of emotional awareness, if
Mhm.
they're not, totally in fight, flight, freeze mode,
You
they
feel it.
start to pick up on it. They
Yeah.
start to recognize, oh, this person actually is interested and cares about what's important to me. So even if our guess is off, the sincerity of our intention to understand will have an effect and start to shift that relational field in the conversation.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you.
Mm.
When we get to that point where we are beginning to understand our own motivations and feelings and all of that and have that awareness, and we can then engage in difficult discussion,
Mhm.
how do we bring our intention back to wisdom, to connection, to that sense of opening for the betterment, the goodness of the entire conversation? Because
Mm.
I notice a lot of times in conversations I have with other people as well, there's this shift that happens. We start to feel ourselves slowly somehow, whether through meditation or just different kinds of practice, and then we can start to have that sense of empathy. But that doesn't mean difficulty goes away.
Right.
It
Yeah.
doesn't mean that challenge isn't there. It
Yeah.
does mean, however, that there's a possibility, there's a potential for opening into that challenge
Mhm.
with wisdom and connection. How would you describe that?
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a rich area, Sarah, and
Mm.
it's I think the first and most fundamental thing is to recognize that difficult conversations and conflict are entirely normal. They're not a problem, it's not something that's gone wrong, it's actually par for the course of being human.
Oh,
Is it
everybody, I hope you heard that. That's so important.
you know,
You can say that again. Just say that again.
difficult conversations and conflict are part of being human.
Yeah.
It's just the nature of being here. And in fact, there if we learn how to relate to them in a skillful way, they become a profound opportunity for transformation, learning, deepening intimacy. It's how we actually get to know each other in a way, is where we rub up against one another and recognize, oh, we have a difference here. It's like, oh, well, let's learn from that. How is it for you and how is it for me? It's the crucible within which so many of our own better qualities can develop, and the level of trust and clarity and intimacy in relationship can grow. So this is fundamental, recognizing and just starting to have a different view about conflict and difficult conversations shifts our whole orientation to them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we need to build capacity slowly. So
That's so
most of
important.
us have
Mm.
had a lot of painful experiences in conflict. We lose relationships, and that hurts. It's hard, 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 right?
Yeah.
We end up feeling um, deeply bereft, or our needs for understanding or not being seen or mattering. When those needs aren't met, it leaves a wound. It hurts. It can hurt for many years. And so it's important to start to heal those places of disconnect where we have had experiences that conflict and difficult conversations lead to pain, disconnection, and harm.
Mm.
That's not just going to go away overnight. So one of the things that I talk about in all of my communication training is this principle of start small and build capacity.
Mm.
Don't go to the most difficult conversation in your life right away as soon as you start learning communication skills and expect to have a different outcome.
Yeah.
Do it in a low stakes situation with somebody that you have a lot of trust, where there's a lot of love in the bank, and you can experiment and give your nervous system
Mm.
the experience of having a different outcome. And then what we're doing there is we're starting to reset some of the wiring that, oh, conflict can actually be okay. I could navigate this. I have some tools. I can trust myself. There's a different possibility here. So that's the second thing, is to start small and build capacity so that we develop more stability and resilience and stamina to be able to have some of the harder conversations that we need to be having today in our communities. Then there's a whole range of really concrete things that we can do to be in difficult conversations in a different way. And as you said, stay connected to our better intentions and our wisdom. One is to rehearse.
Mm.
Think about it beforehand. Set a really clear intention. Think about the conversation. Think about the other person, what's likely to come up, where you're likely to get stuck. And then consider what intention could really be like a guidepost for me, a North Star, and then connect deeply with that intention. Find some way of representing it in your mind through an image, a word, or a phrase, even like a small object that you can hold in your hand that you imbue through just spending time with it, with that quality. And then in the conversation, you use that as like a mindfulness tool to come back to that phrase or image or object as a way to stay connected to that intention. Um, and then there's a whole set of practices that I teach to stay regulated,
Mm.
staying grounded, feeling your body, being able to take pauses, to very subtly work with the rhythm of your breathing and the pace of your speech in order to modulate and metabolize the activation that's coming up in the conversation, learning how to place your attention in different ways in the space of the room, in the whether you're focusing on what's being said or the spaces and the silence in the conversation. All of those can help us to stay grounded and regulated, so that in the conversation we are coming from a place of flexibility and awareness, making conscious choices rather than moving into habit and reactivity. And then maybe the last thing I would say, one of the most powerful things we can do in difficult conversations, focus on how you want to show up more than the outcome.
Mm.
Because we
Mhm.
can't control the outcome, because that's determined by a lot of other factors, many of which are outside of our control.
Mhm.
I'm not saying give up on what's important to you. But what I'm saying is that a more reliable way to get there is really be clear about what's in your integrity,
Mm.
what's important to you in how you conduct yourself in this conversation, because that's something that we do have control over. And then, regardless of the outcome, we can have some sense of um, peace, and there's like a quality of wholeness inside, knowing that I did everything I could, and I really engaged in a way um, that's respectable. I don't
Mm,
have regrets about what I said or how I responded in that conversation.
yeah, that's great. It it's coming up for me that there's this another quality of another tool that we can use in that time that you talk a lot about in your book as well, which is how we work with body language and
Mhm.
tone of voice, and how that sometimes the tone of voice that we use or the body language that we have actually says more than the words.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, when we're angry and frustrated and in that kind of heightened place, how can we stay more aware of our body language and actually, work with it in a way that's going to be of benefit to the conversation as opposed to, derailing the conversation.
Yeah, yeah, it's very true. It's a good question. You know, my orientation to this, which is not to say it's the right orientation or the only orientation, but most most of us, my experience has been that most of us are congruent. In other words, how we're feeling inside and the intentions and the emotions that we have show up in our facial expressions, our tone of voice, and our body language. So, um, and that's just how we're wired. We're deeply empathic, sensitive, and social creatures. It tends to get covered over through life experience and the socialization process, but those capacities and signals are still there. And so, even when we're not aware of it, we are sending and picking up on signals from one another
Sure.
non-verbally. And where those signals are coming from, like, Paul Ekman has done research on the micro expressions, these very
Mhm.
subtle facial expressions that will reveal an emotion that register just below the surface of awareness in a conversation. We can't actually control those,
Mm.
and I wouldn't recommend trying to. I think that the place where we would have the most leverage and the most um, impact is really attending to what's happening inside and how we're feeling. So if I'm angry, if I'm frustrated, if I'm feeling defensive, rather than say trying to control that and put on an air of body language and facial expression that says something else, which isn't going to work anyway, because the other person's going to pick up on what I'm feeling, to just really attend to those emotions that are underneath, either before the conversation or in real time, and to find a way, one, of taking responsibility for how we're feeling, right? And it's not to say that we don't hold other people accountable for their actions, but recognizing, like, if I'm angry, that's about something that matters to me, and to own it, and to find a way to be transparent about that anger that is still respectful and dignified. There's a lot of agency in that, a lot of strength in that, and being able to say, I'm really upset about this, and here's why. If we can do that, we're coming into a more congruent relationship with what's inside and how we're showing up. So this is one of the main ways that I suggest people work with those nonverbal signals. Um, is to attend to your internal experience. If you are carrying blame, judgment, reactivity, do the work with whatever tools you have at your disposal to understand where that's coming from and transform it so that you're taking ownership of the emotions and the reactivity that you're feeling. That's number one. Then number two, I would say, is through mindfulness practice, developing more awareness, more body awareness, just more awareness of how we're feeling in the moment and how we're showing up. And so, because our body language, our tone of voice reflects our internal state, sometimes we might get the signal that we are feeling defensive or
Mm.
hurt or activated, by noticing our body language and by noticing, gee, I'm speaking really quickly and I've raised the volume of my voice, or I'm sitting here like this with my arms folded. We might notice that posture
Mhm.
and then work backwards from there and go like, oh yeah, okay, that's what's happening. So through increased mindfulness and self-awareness, we can use those signals to point back to what's happening inside and then again attend to that so that we're showing up in a way that we want to in the conversation.
That's great. Thank you. It's so helpful. I feel like the way you've kind of mapped out this way for us to work with our communication, I think, I hope our audience feels that there's a sense that we could actually improve the quality of our relationships this year.
Yeah.
I know 2020 was really hard for everybody in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
And so here we are, 2021, we're looking at the best year of our life, possibly, hopefully. So I'm wondering if you have any final tips for us how we can really harness these
Mm,
skills for our relationships this coming year.
mm, sure. I'm just going to take a moment to
Nice.
take in the question and see what feels important. I'd say a few things, Sarah. One, I would say look for the goodness in others
Mm,
and trust the goodness in yourself. It's there, and if we stay connected to that in ourself and others, we invite other people into a different kind of relationship.
mm,
And some of that means coming with some humility. If we're in a conflict, if we're having a difficult situation, being willing to ask for help, to be able to say, I'd really like to do this in a way that is supportive to both of us. I'm interested in finding something that really works for both of us. And I'm feeling a little bit stuck about how to do that. I could use some help. Do you have any ideas? Being willing to really engage the other person in the process. And then the last thing I would say is to focus on incremental change.
mm,
To
mm.
bear in mind that all of us are carrying years, if not decades, of habits and patterns around our communication, our emotions, our relationships. And so change happens slowly. And so to just look for one small thing that you can shift, like if there's one thing that you and I have talked about in this interview that really landed for you, that you really said, oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, just focus on that
Yeah.
and make it a practice every day to do a little bit to integrate it into your life. And then if you do that, if you focus on one small thing that you can do every day, over time you'll start to see changes.
Mm, mm. Yeah, it just ripples out.
Mhm.
That's great. Thank you so much. How can our audience find you and find out more about your work?
Sure. So my website, orenjsofer.com, is probably the best place to find out about what I'm doing. I have an email list. I send out a note about once every other week with a short reflection or teaching, and it comes with some guided meditations and a short ebook. So you can find all that on my website. And then I'm also on social media at Oren J. Sofer. If that's your thing, you can find me there. And as you mentioned, Sarah, my book is called Say What You Mean, A Mindful Approach to Nonviolent Communication.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed this conversation. I feel very strongly that our audience will as well. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
You're welcome. It's been a real pleasure, Sarah.